Okay, folks, I think we will make a start. So welcome to the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture based within Regent Park College, that is in turn part of the University of Oxford. This is our second in a series looking at freedom of religion and belief. My name is Anthony Reddy, I'm the director of the centre. And our speaker this evening is now, I don't confess that being a post-colonial Latin refusing, I don't know the difference between my baronesses and my dames, so I did inadvertently call you a dame. I apologise. Baronet, I don't know what the difference is, but there is a difference, and I apologise for getting it wrong. We have Baroness Elizabeth Berridge, who is a life here with the Conservative Party. And I have some details here from Wikipedia, so I'm going to read them out. And if they're correct, raise your thumb. And if they're inaccurate, then obviously have like the down version of it. So it says that you are the second youngest female member of the House of Lords. Is that true?
No, it's not, although the average age is still 71, of which I'm average age. So no, at the time I joined, Anthony, I was the youngest woman, but that's now out of date.
Okay, then. Okay. And you were co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group, the International Freedom of Religion and of Belief. Is that true? Yes.
I indeed was that, yes.
Okay. Well, we are delighted that you are able to join us. At the moment, your volume is slightly low, so I was wondering if you might be able to make it slightly higher.
I have put my speakers up to, it may just be, let me just move nearer to it. Is that better?
A little.
Is that better?
A little, but it could be slightly louder if possible.
Let me just, I'm just trying, let me just, no, sorry, I'm gonna, just try and see. Oh no, sorry. Probably my tech skills here actually being put to the test.
It's quite loud in the cupboard.
Sorry, shall I just try and speak up? Is that okay? Is that better? Is it yours? Could it be your speakers?
Yes.
Yeah, I was fiddling here.
No, thank you. Anyway, so we are delighted that you are here to join us. And we are in your hands, Elizabeth, so please share what you wish, and then at the end of it we'll have a Q&A which I will share, and we'll hope to wrap up by about 6:15, but if you finish slightly earlier, then I doubt it will be upset. But anyway, Elizabeth, we're in your hands.
Thank you. First of all, I need to apologise. As you can probably hear now, the microphone's working. I am totally full of cold, not COVID, thankfully. So I've got a variety of drinks and stuff here to try and keep me going, but that's probably why I sound as I do. But thank you so much, Anthony, for the invitation, and thank you, Professor Sir Malcolm Evans, for also inviting me to speak to you this evening. Just by way of a wee bit more background, I came upon your principal of your college in the context of that work on international freedom of religion or belief, which I believe he spoke about last week to you. Now that was, well, gosh, when I think about it, about 10 or so years ago now. And that was at a time when it was just about the time when there was some awareness beginning of problems in Egypt. That was one of the issues we were dealing with to begin with. There was an attack on a Coptic church on, I think it was New Year's Eve in Alexandria. But it was very much not an issue that people were focusing on in the international context in terms of foreign affairs, particularly in the UK. But through one of those typical sort of things about change, which is a small group of people doing various different things, That work gained a great deal more profile, particularly in the parliamentary context, and the parliamentary work of the International Freedom of Religion or Belief work actually began at Regent's Park College. We hijacked onto a conference sponsored by Brigham Young University, and they brought together some parliamentarians from around the world. There was about 10 of us there, and founded the work that still exists on the International Panel for Freedom of Religion or Belief that's now funded by the Norwegian government. But we saw a progress, and you'll probably have been aware now that the human right of freedom of religion or belief in terms of in the UK Parliament and UK government has a much higher profile due to the work of a small group of people, academics, policymakers, charities and parliamentarians. And so there are many parliamentarians who are now involved, and I'm thinking particularly of the MP for the area where the Vale of Catmos is, and that's Alicia Kearns, who's the Rutland and Melton MP and who's now the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, who talk about the Uyghur Muslims persecution, and that's not from any or not that I'm aware of, from any particular religious background themselves. So it's gone from being particularly with parliamentarians an issue where a few people who themselves, whether they were Ahmadi Muslims or Christians, were concerned about it, to being quite a mainstream human right. And you'll now know that there's the United Kingdom government has a special envoy on freedom of religion or belief. And we hosted the recent ministerial meeting here in London, bringing together people from around the world. So it's really from that sort of context. But then after doing that work, I then left that work to go into government. So I joined the government in, oh my goodness, let me get this right, in July 2019. So I left the sort of choppy world of human rights to join the choppy world of the government, because at that time, Theresa May was the Prime Minister and we were doing all the Brexit thing when Parliament didn't have a majority. So we then obviously changed Prime Ministers, headed into an election, trying to get the Brexit situation sorted out. Then I became a government minister in February 2020, literally 6 weeks. I was in the Department for Education, literally 6 weeks before the pandemic. So I governed during the pandemic, came out again in September 2021, as you do in the kind of government tumble dryer that they have. So after doing that, though, one of the things I've been involved with through all that time is a small charity that we formed called Freedom Declared Foundation, which a few of you may have heard of, but it's very small. And we began just, though, doing some research on the trustees are a combination of Baha'is, two people from Latter-day Saints, myself, and an Ismaili Muslim gentleman. And so that was really looking this beginning again with the same foundations that we began when we ran the all-party parliamentary group. We tried to bring together and get resources from, in terms of cash every month, I might add, to fund the work from all the different faith groups and the humanists, etc., so that everybody was buying in. So we founded this charity, and there's 5 of us who are currently trustees. And we began to look at, though, what is the history and what is the context of freedom of religion or belief in the UK? And so, first of all, I just want to say, where in the UK have we come from? And we tend to start, and we just decided to start looking, from the Magna Carta. And when you sort of look at that, and we obviously celebrated 800 years of the Magna Carta recently, which was obviously a very big deal. But one of the things that I focused on was the fact that, which is often overlooked, the very beginning of the Magna Carta, which of course was written by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, and there had been a lot of dispute about whether Rome or whether the king should be involved in appointing the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Magna Carta begins with basically, and I'm putting it in modern language obviously here, the English church shall be free. And I remember phoning at that time, I was doing a talk on the Magna Carta and freedom of religion or belief. So I phoned up somebody who, one of the co-authors of a book called Magna Carta and the Rule of Law, a gentleman called Igor Judge, none other than the former president of the Supreme Court, who's a colleague here. That's the joy of the House of Lords. And I rang him up and just said, do you think it was important that when this was still obviously the Roman Catholic Church, that it was written the English church shall be free? And he said, yes, indeed, it really was, because it was about all of this dispute about who should actually be supreme in terms of appointing the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so it's one of the first statements for us about the freedom of the English church vis-a-vis the king and the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but freedom also from Rome, from the Vatican. So we're going from like 1215, and obviously I'm doing a very high level, and there's more detail on the Freedom Declared website, to obviously the moment most people know of, which is in 1521 with Henry VIII, who goes from, it's quite interesting when you think, goes from being told by the Pope, Leo X, that he's the defender of the faith, obviously something that we're now looking at because of the coronation, because of a book that he wrote at that time, to, of course, needing his own divorce. And there's the beginning of the Church of England and the break of our church with the role of Rome and the role of the Vatican. But then we get, of course, then it's not as if the beginning of the Church of England and Anglicanism is a sort of high point of freedom of religion or belief, because then, of course, you have the Acts of Uniformity trying to curtail the use of the Catholic Mass. And, of course, you will know, of course, at Regent's Park College, because you have a hall called Helwys Hall, that in 1612, Thomas Helwys gets into a big trouble with King James I, bizarrely of the Bible translation, for his book called The Short Declaration on the Mystery of Iniquity, which is one of the first declarations of what we now know to be freedom of religion or belief, but also, very importantly, the separation of church and state. And obviously, as you'll be aware, he dies in Newgate prison for his trouble. Of course, we've then got the seminal moment in 1620 where the Pilgrim Fathers leave via Plymouth to go and establish English culture rather than obviously Dutch culture, which they didn't like apparently when they went across to Holland, and begin the founding of what we now know as the United States of America. But of course, that was already occupied by many indigenous groups. Things get a little bit better, obviously, under Thomas Cromwell and Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century, and we get the return of the Jews who've been expelled in the 13th century, and we get some recognition of the liberty of conscience. But when we though get into the later 17th century, we are though still looking at things like public offices only being reserved for Anglicanism, and we then have the seminal sort of Bill of Rights in 1689. So it takes most of the 18th and 19th century to begin to unpick a lot of this as well. And it's not until sort of 1858 where really there's equality for Jews and Catholics. And obviously for a university context, it's the late 19th century when people are allowed to go to university and get degrees. So we've come from a place of a great deal of strife, and we have come from a place where really within Christianity itself, we have shed blood both ways in terms of Catholicism and the Church of England, and also not been as welcoming, of course, in previous centuries to those who were non-conformists, obviously Regent's Park College being founded on that basis, but also for other faiths. But by the time we get into the 20th century, we have, learnt many of our lessons, and obviously take part in the European Convention on Human Rights, but we still have had a legacy until very recently, like it's only 2008 that the blasphemy law was repealed. And then we've also had the later repeal, I think in 2013, where the monarch can be married to a Catholic, but of course the monarch cannot be a Catholic. So that's where we've come from. So I think we do, and I haven't obviously touched there on any of our activities overseas, which of course is one of the things that is pretty controversial about what we did when we were in other countries, shall I put it neutrally like that. Whilst there may be many in the diaspora who are very positive about the role of taking Christianity, particularly to other nations, there's obviously two sides to that, and a lot of lessons to be learned there. So when we look today, and when we take a step back, and sometimes I think our news generally doesn't enable us to do this, is to take a step back and look globally. So when I sort of think I've started with Article 18 and looking at the horrendous situation that there is in many countries for people, and looking at our history and where we've got to, we could say, well, generally, we're healthy, we do allow, when I sort of think about what we are allowed still under the charities, under our charitable law here, promoting religion is one of the grounds to found a charity. You can, you form an organisation, you can form a charity or a company, you can buy land, you can run your own services when you're not monitored by the state in terms of what you do. You can employ your own people. There are allowances even outside of religious organisations themselves, but particularly for religious charities to employ people of your own religion within certain constraints. And you can be massively involved in education here. And about a third of our schools are faith-based schools. And obviously a lot of that has been Church of England schools, but then there's obviously a lot of Catholic schools, and there is I think a statutory requirement to ensure that there are enough Catholic school places for the Catholic population in England and Wales. And then since 2010, particularly, though there were originally some Jewish schools, but since 2010, with the opening up of the academies and free schools, there's now schools that are Muslim ethos schools, Sikh ethos schools, and Hindu ethos schools. So in terms of the involvement in education, there's a great deal of freedom there, and a great deal of freedom to employ your staff within certain constraints. And that's always the thing, as I'm sure you all know, within human rights law, besides the freedom to hold the beliefs you want to hold and freedom from torture, those are the only two absolute rights, and everything else in the human rights world is usually the subject of boundaries and of balancing one interest with another. So in terms of the situation today, yes, we can look at that and say, yeah, we are in a really good place, and particularly when I'm saying relative to the global situation in many other countries. However, I'm not sure, and this is probably what you'll go away thinking, well, we're just really not sure about really the robustness of freedom of religion or belief, certain aspects of it in the UK. And the reason I say that is, having listened to, many of you will have listened to the recent Reith lecture by the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, talking about freedom of worship based on the 4 foundational freedoms of Roosevelt's speech. And it's obviously it is a good lecture, very intellectual lecture, but it doesn't deal with the rub of some of freedom of religion or belief. And the edgy part often of freedom of religion or belief is the conversion edge. And I think that's a theme when you look at some of the problems from overseas. Some countries where there is quite a lot of freedom to worship how you want to worship, and that's okay. But once you step beyond that and want other people to join your faith and leave, particularly if it's the faith of the state that's aligned to it, that's where the rub comes. And we don't really know in the UK, really. I did, sort of try and do some research on this, and found some information on the deed poll site, just about the reasons people change their name by deed poll. That seemed to be some of the best descriptors of why people might be changing their faith. But we don't know how those freedoms are. And we don't know particularly in much depth, what is at the edge of many of the religious faiths as well. In terms of those who want to ensure that their children particularly grow up in their own faith, but where is the boundary there between, yes, you want to promote your own faith and form that faith in your children or within the community, with actually depriving them of the plurality of views that there are in England and Wales particularly. So and you see that sometimes in education, and particularly in what I have to say, I thought from my own experience was the excellent work that Ofsted were doing, trying to inspect particularly the independent schools that are the smaller independent schools, most of whom are fine, but then you get some that they're really trying to make sure that those children are getting the breadth of education that we would expect children to get in the UK, and deal with any of what we would call illegal schools, where people are basically educating. It's a school, but it's outside of any proper registration, and it's not giving the breadth of curriculum to children because they want to just give them a religious curriculum sometimes. So we don't really know. Probably Ofsted are probably the best informed on what's actually going on in that aspect of this. And I think there were obviously within, because we've just been through a pandemic, I think that was, for many religious people, that was a bit of a shock in terms of how quickly religious establishments closed, particularly in the first lockdown, and the little resistance that there was to the closure. And it's very interesting when you read the Scottish case, because I'm sure many of you are aware that coming in the later lockdowns, there was a legal challenge, and the only human right that any of our courts said had been breached during the pandemic was actually the Scottish court saying that actually the blanket closure of places for both collective worship and private prayer was a breach of the Article 9 right. It's important to note that obviously at that time, places of worship were within guidance and restrictions were open in England at that time. But I think the judgment is really worth reading in terms of why and how the decision making went wrong in that case. And whether this is another question, whether is this a reflection, because I'm sure you're aware, Scotland has secularised, as in being not religious, more quickly than England and Wales has. And is the decision-making process and the information that the Scottish executive had a reflection of that? I don't know. But reading the things that struck me, and for those of you who don't know, there was a constitutional argument that basically the Scottish government has absolutely no right, because unlike England, it's not an established church and it's free from interference by government in spiritual matters. That argument didn't succeed. The argument was on the basis of proportionality, and was the risk from the pandemic, was closing all the places of worship at that time proportionate? And proportionality has basically 4 limbs from a famous legal case called Bank Mallet. And it failed though on the 3rd and 4th limb. But interestingly, which basically means there were other means that were less intrusive that could have achieved the end. And also the balancing of the effect for the community rights and the rights of the people whose freedom of worship was restricted. But the interesting things I noted from the case was the need to define what worship was. So there's a whole section of the judgment which is saying, no, online is not the same as worship, as collective worship. So that was sort of a foundational factual matter they had to decide, because the Scottish government's view and the civil servants' view was just basically, oh, it's online, it's the same. And they had to point out, no, this is not the same, because these involve things like, sacraments like confession and communion, etc., that you can't do online. And online was decided to be an alternative to worship, not worship itself, which is obviously important for Article 9. The second thing that I just thought was interesting about it was that the government lost on the 3rd limb of the test about other means being less intrusive, partly because it got the numbers completely wrong. It didn't know how many people and I think if I'm remembering correctly, they couldn't remember where they got 800,000 worshippers from, where actually the other information that the petitioners produced was that there's about 300,000 people. So when you're trying to measure risk of a pandemic, you really do need to know what amount of the population is going to be going into these buildings before you start legislating about. So I thought they just basically got the numbers wrong. So was that a moment of sort of really big religious illiteracy? There was also obviously an intervener, as we would call it, in the English system, that was a Catholic priest. Obviously, the main case was being brought by the Protestant churches in Scotland. And of course, they'd overlooked the fact that baptism is a sacrament for the Catholics. So you've got these exemptions for weddings and for funerals, but you haven't got any exemption for baptism. So there seemed to be this moment of not realising that actually the Catholics, that was an issue as well. And also, they just didn't sort of take into account that in some of the emails that were disclosed or in the evidence, that it was kind of viewed like, well, you're kind of going to be lonely, just because, the same as there's been, the lockdowns, and you're not going to be able to do your luncheon club. And it was viewed as like a social consideration that there was the closure of the churches. There wasn't really any consideration of the spiritual aspect of people being able to worship together, etc. And then there was also the aspect that they never considered, the difference between, okay, collective worship, which is bringing people together, with, well, why can't a church be open for private prayer? Why can't people, go and do their shopping and then pop into the church? What increase in risk is that? And I think overall, looking at the judgment and looking at the case, it does seem that actually, and it's an interesting comparator that the judge gives of the need to keep open criminal courts and the need to use cinemas and bring together juries, which again are people from different households coming together inside a building, And the need, obviously, the need of the state and the need to do criminal trials within a reasonable period of time seem to be weighed on very, very heavily in the mind of the Scottish government. But the Article 9 right didn't really seem to be weighing as heavily. And I think that was a really interesting approach the judge took, and rectifying the balance. The Article 9 is a very, very important human right. And if you are saying that it's so important to keep criminal trials going, it's an equivalent. They didn't use the word equivalence, but it seems in the judgment they're saying this is more important than the Scottish government really thought that it was at the time. So I thought that, and to me, it was just kind of like, is this a sign of, like, when you have, you know, a declining number of the population who are religious in general, and we've had since that case, we've had the census results, are we going to see more and more of this kind of thinking that actually the spiritual life of people is not as important as the social life of people? So I just thought it was interesting, and that we shouldn't really be resting on our laurels in relation to that. So as I say, so I just think most of what I have to say on the current state is we don't know, and I'm seeking to work with Anthony and Malcolm on what further research do we need to do here. I left social media when I left government because I thought I've had enough of this, so I may be out of date, but when I was on social media, there were groups like ex-Muslim groups and other groups springing up who were trying to sort of talk about the effects for them of and they hadn't necessarily converted, they had just left being of a particular faith. And that can be the case. Most of you will know of the Netflix documentary Unorthodox. It can be the case in most of our major faiths that when people have left that faith, even if they've not converted and joined anybody else, or they might become an agnostic, is the effect on them and them saying that actually they're not free to do X, Y, and Z, even though that they have left that particular faith group. So I think there's lots of questions to be asked. There's lots of needs to know whether there are barriers for people. For instance, there are certain extremes of the Christian faith that would deny people access to tertiary education, that would exclude people from the community they have grown up in if they leave that community. So where are these boundaries? I think there's a lot more research that we need to do on this. And as I say, they're finding social media to be the platform to start talking and find other people who are in that situation. So obviously, and I'm going to conclude in a minute before my voice gets out, I've considered the 2016 Equality and Human Rights Commission report, which is mainly on FORB in the workplace in England. And it's interesting that when you talk to religious people in England particularly, it's not as if I think most people have an awareness when you're at church that maybe the Charity Commission has got something to do with what you're doing or whatever, and safeguarding, they're aware of safeguarding, etc. And obviously that's an issue with, sorry, Professor Malcolm, if you're much more eloquent on that than I am, but they don't really think of the Equality and Human Rights Commission as the body that would be there to stand up for them, protect them, take action on them. No one was talking about EHRC during the closure of places of worship during the pandemic. So I think there is an issue here. In the 2016 report, when you read that compared to the judgment actually in the Scottish courts, I think it's it's quite optimistic about, I think, how a lot of religious people would talk about their experience in the workplace as a protected characteristic in the workplace. And I think there's a helpful challenge that I think we need. I myself am a Christian, but it's religious beliefs to say, actually, is the position, are you going to look at this edgy part of this human right here, whether people in England are free to convert from one religion to another part? So I'm afraid this is a talk which has got a lot of don't knows in it, because, as I say, we haven't really got the information. That might be a good thing. It might be because things are generally good and therefore we don't really need to be doing the research. I just wonder, though, whether we might be resting on our laurels and we might be seeing a period of time where those freedoms that were hard won for us might actually be under strain in the whole value system sort of polarisation often that we're getting, and will religious organisations come under renewed pressure as they, maybe some of them stand in contradiction in the true sense of the word to certain cultural norms? Will they come under, will their charitable status be threatened as a result of that? We don't know. I think there is a case for a lot more research to know exactly what is happening in the granular in terms of people's lives and their ability to particularly to not just express their faith, but to change their particular faith. But that is all. So it's a seminar, probably the only one in this series, which ends with a we don't know. I think we need to know a lot more. And I'm really pleased that the Scottish churches challenged what they did, because we've got a lot of that reasoning out as to what was actually going on in the Scottish executive at that time. So thank you so much, everybody, for your time, and I'm pleased that my voice has lasted this long at the moment.
Thank you very much.